Welcome to the panel on interviewing as a two-way street. We have three very distinguished panelists who I think offer a wide swath of perspectives, tips, and I think it's going to be a pretty exciting session. My name is Shubha Chakravarti. As Cynthia mentioned, I work at HSBC. My background has been predominantly in financial services. I'm a Booth alum. I got my MBA here in 2000, and since then I've had stints in consulting. I worked for McKinsey & Company for a while. I've also worked for a couple of different insurance companies, Allstate among others. And then I've been with HSBC for the last 7 years or so. Today we have on our panel, we have Ramon Gutierrez, who is Preston and Sterling Morton Distinguished Service Professor in United States History and the College of the University of Chicago. We're delighted to have him here. We also have David Schuster, who is Assistant Professor, I have to refer to my notes here, of Physics at the James Franck Institute, also at the University of Chicago, who I think will offer pretty interesting perspectives from a hard sciences perspective. Delighted to have you here. And then we have Josh Keller. I'm outscienced here. Josh Keller is a consultant at the Boston Consulting Group. And Josh brings a pretty interesting and eclectic background. As I was going over it and talking to him prior to this panel, he has a PhD in Material Sciences and Engineering from Northwestern University. And his academic background covers, among other things, poetry, engineering. I don't know how those two come together, but apparently they do very well. So we're delighted to have you here. Thanks for coming.
Thank you.
So what we're planning to do today is we're going to talk about interviewing as a two-way street. And the way we're going to do this is we're going to break it up into 4 different sections, right? So the first piece is how do you go about preparing for an interview? What are the things you have to do? And hopefully we'll have a bunch of different thoughts that our panelists here will share with us. The second piece is around presenting yourself at the interview. How do you do the best job you can while you're at the interview itself? The third piece, which a lot of people forget, is about the follow-up, right? How do you follow up effectively after an interview? How do you continue to pursue the sale, as you will, or if you will, right? And make sure that you're making the best possible case for your prospects, excuse me, at a potential employer. And last but not least, we also want to talk about some special situations and special considerations. For example, what if you have, if you're a hard sciences or a soft sciences major, what are some of the considerations if perhaps you have an international background or have certain different challenges than your typical student here? So those are sort of the high-level sections that we want to talk about on this panel. I'd ask you and encourage you to ask questions. Just give us some chance to kind of hear what everybody has to say on the panel here on a given topic. Please put up your hand, and I think we do have folks with mics who will come to you if you have a question. So with that, why don't I turn it over to our panelists. I'll start with you, Ramon, if you wouldn't mind giving us maybe a little bit of a further introduction into your background and your high-level thoughts on interviewing as a process as a whole. That'd be a good way to get us started.
Okay, I was raised in New Mexico, got an undergraduate degree in art history, went on to linguistics, and then finally into Latin American history. I've taught here at the University of Chicago since 2007. Before that, I was at UC San Diego for 27 years. I'd say the most important thing in interviewing, whether you're interviewing in the humanities, social sciences, divinity, is to know who your interviewers are. And by that I mean understand that every single job that most of you are probably going to apply for, unless you're at the Booth School or unless you're at one of the professional schools, let's say the law school, and you're going to try to get a job at a law firm, is to try to understand that what they're looking for is a teacher. You're being recruited as a person who's going to fill a certain area of the curriculum. And so it is important to understand what kind of institution you're going to be teaching at and that is trying to recruit a teacher. Most of you are trained as researchers, as high-level theoreticians. And so here's where the rubber doesn't hit the road so easily, where you may be expecting that the interviewers want to hear about your research. They do, but they also want to know how you're going to fit into the curriculum, how you're going to contribute to the curricular matrix that they have. So the first thing I would do would be then to do a web search on the institution that you're applying to. Try to find out who the interviewers are. Look up their personal biographies. What have they written lately? If you have the time, then make sure that you've maybe read an article by them or at least an abstract of their work so that you can, when you meet them and you introduce yourself, you can easily say, oh yes, I've read your latest paper on chicken farmers in Iowa, or I've read your theoretical piece on the history of physics, whatever it happens to be. Try to find out either by asking some of the students that teach there, that work there or are going to school there, or by calling the graduate secretary or one of the secretaries in the department, how your position is being filled. Is it somebody retiring? Is it a new area of expertise? So that when you get there, you know what kind of institution it is, who's going to be interviewing you, and exactly how the job ad that was advertising for a specialist in 19th century Russian history, for 20th century American literature, for 17th century history of science fits into the broader curriculum and what they expect you to contribute to that institution.
Perfect, thank you. David?
Thank you. Yeah, so my name is David Schuster. I'm an assistant professor in the physics department. I came here about 2 years ago, so I've still fairly recently had the experience of interviewing, both as postdoc and as a faculty member. And then it's been about 2 years now, so I've also had the opportunity to start a group where I've hired students and postdocs, and I've gone through many interviews now, and I'm still learning how to do it from the other side, and it's been pretty interesting as well. So in addition, I've also been on the appointments committee for our faculty hiring. University of Chicago is actually quite an interesting place in that they really take into account the younger professors' opinions very strongly. So I've gotten to see that, and let me tell you that if you sit on one of these things, and you've been hired, you immediately wonder how it was ever possible that happened. But nevertheless, I can try and share that with you. From my perspective, well, actually, one thing I heard Ramon say that, which is kind of an interesting thing, was he emphasized the teaching aspect of being hired. In the sciences, actually, it's often the research is more strongly emphasized, and so there's really a lot of differences between humanities and sciences, and of course, if you're looking to go out into the outer world, outside the ivory tower, I guess. And so I think that's going to be a fun thing with this panel. And I'd like to emphasize this point about really knowing who your interviewers are and doing a little bit of research. I mean, it always, it makes a big difference. For example, if someone comes in and they're interviewing with me and they've even if they haven't read and understood fully the papers, if they've read enough that they can ask intelligent questions, it really, both because, of course, they prepared and that's good, but also because if they're asking questions, it gives you a much better ability to assess them, and presumably you guys are all great, and if they only knew how great you were, they would hire you. So you really want to give them every opportunity to find out about you.
Thank you, David.
Yep.
Josh.
Sure. So I'm Josh Keller. I do have a fairly diverse background, and I'll try to explain why that might be useful for the topic of this panel. I studied physics and English and went on and got an MFA in poetry, worked in policy for a few years before I came back and got my PhD at Northwestern in materials science and engineering, did a postdoc, and then ended up in consulting at the Boston Consulting Group, where I've been for a couple of years. And since the theme of this panel is, at least the first question, as I understand it, is a two-way street and how that relates to interviewing, I would say that I completely agree that the first objective you have is to understand what you're applying for, but the reason for that is that the topic of the interview is it's you and how you fit into where you're applying. So one thing I would always hear, when people talk about interviewing and what they don't like, is I don't like talking about myself. An interview is sort of talking about yourself, but the actual topic is why I'm right for this position, which is a little bit different. So you have to know a lot about the organization, and you have to do your homework. But then there's another really important part, which is listening when you're in an interview. So if it becomes a monolithic discussion about you, you're going to miss the cues that you need to explain exactly where the interview is trying to get you to go. And at least when I've been in a position of interviewing people, you're usually rooting for them. You want them to win. You want them to get the job. You want them to say the things that you need them to say to translate a really great resume and a person that looks like a good fit into the person we're going to hire. So just keep that in mind, the piece about listening. And then the other part is the ability to tell a story. So when you listen and you get the right cues, the reason I would say having a diverse background is relevant is I've had to reshape my story several times to change course in my career, and I think that's always fine. But if you think about what your story is and how that story fits into that intersection of you and the job, and then you listen and adjust the details, I think that's how you ultimately are going to be successful.
Great, that was a fantastic introduction, and thank you all. I think I want to pick up on some key threads that all of you mentioned as we kind of head into the first topic, which is preparation. I think the couple of things that I think were really important that you already hit on were making sure that you know the role, the interviewer, making sure you understand why you're the right person for this position before you can sell somebody else. Maybe I'll start with you, Josh, if you don't mind, and talk about, I'm sitting here, I know I have an interview coming up, but potentially I have 2 or 3 different types of interviews I'm going to be preparing for. Can you talk a little bit, especially with your experience, about how do you then look at your resume and then start the process of putting together those stories from your bullet points in your resume so that you're crafting your story to hit a certain profile or a certain set of skills that your potential employer is looking for? What are some of the things you do? What are some of the things you found helpful?
Yeah, so one thing is, as best as possible, reach out to people you know who've been successful in the field you're in, and it will be different, and they will tell you the characteristics they're looking for. And then I would make sure that when you're looking at the resume, if you think about what are the qualities someone is looking for in this job, which of the pieces on my resume are the ones that I can bring that out? And it may not necessarily immediately be the way you've always talked about your research experience in a lab, but maybe for this job what you're trying to do is highlight your independence. And so by talking to people who've been successful, understanding, and go on the websites too, most companies or research positions, you'll get a sense of people's backgrounds and what the qualities are that make them successful, and figure out how you tell your story from your resume to get those qualities across in the interview in a really succinct way.
So are there, to your point, are there specific things that we want to make sure that you highlight when you're bringing that out? Is there something that strikes you as being particularly important that you may have seen or done to great effect yourself?
Yeah, so I think that one thing that makes it helpful is I'm from my storytelling time, it's a show, don't tell. So I do like to illustrate it with a nice, clear example. So if I'm trying to say that, my ability to lecture in front of a bunch of people, how does that going to translate to communication skills? I wouldn't just say that's, purely I have communication skills because I've lectured. In particular, if you can get it into an anecdote that really sharply puts into focus how a particular experience you've had demonstrated the quality you're trying to get across, I think that tends to be more effective in an interview.
Great, thank you. I'm going to turn gears slightly, Ramon and David, because you have slightly different perspectives on this. Now, you had mentioned, David, that it's very important to make sure that the research piece gets highlighted. Do you have any specific tips, for those of us in the hard sciences here, what do you need to think about as you prepare for your interview in terms of highlighting your research?
Yes, so, again, it depends, I suppose, whether you're going into a kind of an industry science job or whether in academia. In academia, the good news is it's actually fairly structured. And that makes life kind of easy in some sense. That, all of your applications will be almost identical, and even though and every place is different, but they will all ask you similar things. So of course it starts when you prepare. The hardest part is actually getting the interview. If you've gotten the interview, you're already in pretty good shape. But in order to do that, a lot of it, of course, you can't change. You can't change immediately what papers you've written and things like that. That's already set. But you can make sure that you have the best reference letters you can have, because that's incredibly important and probably as important for getting an interview. And then you often are asked to craft a research statement. And the importance for the research statement, I guess there are a couple points for that. So the first thing is that most people won't read it. Actually, even you're lucky if the whole appointments committee reads it, which doesn't mean that you shouldn't put a lot of time into it, but it means that you should write. If they just read like the first paragraph, for example, they should really have a good idea of what you want to accomplish in your in your first years, like what is going to be the focus of your work. They should also get an idea of why you're the uniquely qualified person in the world to do this. In science, really, if you're a faculty member at a top department, you're the best in the world at whatever it is you do. I mean, you might do something really obscure, but you're the best at it. And so you have to explain to them why that thing that you want to do is important and relevant, and why you're uniquely qualified, in particular, with respect to your former advisors and other people maybe in the department. You know, you need to say how you're going to build on the experience you learned, but also you'll be different from your advisor, who of course has more money and more students and everything like that. And the other thing is just that, hopefully during this process, during the interview, during your application, you'll at some point get sort of some advocates within the panel. It's absolutely necessary that someone on the appointments committee really be enthralled with you and support you. And by this statement is a good opportunity to sort of give them a little, almost a prepared speech to give to their colleagues. I've definitely heard people in the meetings essentially reading from the research statement saying, isn't this a really wonderful idea? So I think, in terms of getting the interview, I would say that's quite important. And once you're there, I think the what Ramon said earlier about really preparing, they basically will have you talk to the whole department. And so it's a really good idea to know what everybody's doing. And so, to have an idea of how you might work together. It's not that you necessarily have to collaborate with each person, but at least why you would be interested in what they have to do and why they should be interested in what you're doing. And then there's typically often, there's either one or sometimes two talks that you end up having to give. So one is typically what I've done and why I'm so great, and with a little bit maybe on what's coming next. And then often, but not always, they'll have you do sort of a more forward-looking talk as to what you're going to do there, which is usually more informal. So you also want to have those prepared well.
Great, thanks, David. And I just want to pitch in with one comment. At least in industry and business, which is kind of where I'm from, it's extremely critical to have what we call an elevator pitch. So it's your 30-second story about, here's what I've done and here's where I hope to add value. And a lot of that focus is on how you're going to fit in with the organization's priorities and their strategic focus. Now, I'm just curious to see if any of you can relate to that statement and to what extent it's true in academia, and what additional comments or insights any of you might be able to add to that.
I think it's definitely true.
Yeah, I would say, when I ask my student, I run a weekly workshop for history graduate students that are on the job market. And one of the things I ask them to do are to prepare 2 90-second statements that they write out and they memorize and commit to, and are able to recite at the drop of a dime, because these are 2 questions that are going to be asked automatically. One is, tell me about your research. That's usually the beginning question that they're going to ask. Tell me about your research. So in 90 seconds, because the other thing that's going to happen, you're going to be nervous, you're probably going to be uncertain as to what kinds of questions are going to come at you. So when you have two answers that you've recited, and committed to memory, you can easily rely on those 2 answers to get you through the nervous part of the interview. And the first is, what is your research about and what is important about it? And I ask my students to answer 3 questions. The so what question, like I'm studying chicken farmers in Iowa. So what? Why is that important? What is it? How is it going to significantly shift the contours of how we study chicken farmers around the world, or the distribution of eggs, or the consumption of protein, or small businesses and how they operated? Then what's new about the topic? How do you fit into existing debates that are central to your discipline, or that are contemporarily being debated in the journals that you subscribe to or most often read? And then how does it fit into the other specializations that the department has? Because again, if they're trying to hire an 18th century poet, a 19th century literary scholar, a 20th century religion professor, they're going to want to know how you fit into the matrix that is already there. The second thing they're going to ask you is, well, what is your teaching experience? Do you have teaching experience? And then you should be able to say, again, with your 90-second answer that you've memorized, well, I've taught this, that, and the other. And I brought with me my sample syllabi so that you can see how I've organized my course. Now, if you bring the sample syllabi, those are going to be automatically become the topic of discussion that you passed out. They'll look at them and they'll say, well, why did you choose, Richard Cox instead of Mary White as the beginning text for this class? Why are you doing this and not that? How have your students responded to your teaching techniques? Because they'll also want to know your teaching philosophy. So if you can get some syllabi, a teaching philosophy statement, and what courses you would teach, those are going to be the automatic questions that are going to come at you with a great amount of regularity. The last thing I would say is to something that the other speakers haven't mentioned yet, is kind of the somatics of you at the interview. That is, make sure that you are not the object of attention because you're wearing a spiked red dyed hair, or you're wearing so many earrings and tattoos on your face, or that you're not dressed appropriately for the institution that has given you an interview. Remember that since antique times in diplomatic gestures, the inferior guest always dons the clothes of the superior host. And therefore, dress as if you're going to a meeting with superior hosts that are going to be judging you. Because at the end of the day, what every institution wants is somebody that's going to fit in, somebody that they're going to be comfortable having cocktails with, somebody that they can easily play tennis or golf with, and somebody that they can relate to on a day-to-day basis without any fear of conflict or such cultural differences in approaches to the world that you're constantly butting heads against each other. So, try to understand who your interviewers are and try to make yourself into that person, at least for the moment of the interview. When you get the job offer, then you can decide whether you want to be there or not.
Great. Thank you, Ramon. And that is a great segue into our presentation section. But before we wrap the preparation section, there's just one thing that I want to throw out to all of you guys to see what your thoughts are. I mean, typically we've always focused on interview as our selling ourselves to the organization or the potential employer. I think a key aspect of that is also the reverse flow of information to assess whether you think you would be happy with that organization, right? And whether you think, because it is, after all, in many cases, a long-term commitment that is made, so it makes a lot of sense. So just a last couple of comments maybe in terms of as you go into this preparation phase and before we head into presentation at the interview, what tips can you offer to our, to our audience here in terms of preparing to ask them questions? What kind of what do you do to make sure you're asking them the right questions and getting that information you need to figure out if it's a fit from your side as well?
Yeah, I'm happy to start with that. I actually think that's really important, right? Because it gets at something we were just talking about, which is in the elevator pitch, part of what you're trying to do is generate enthusiasm and excitement about what you've done. And then there's also a piece about that you're doing through the interview, which is how you fit into the organization in the future, and you want to generate excitement about that on their end. On the inverse, you should believe that, right? So if you don't actually believe it, it's a bit of a problem. So whatever the pieces are that are missing for you, that you've been unable to track down, you really should be probing for those pieces of information. So typically there will be opportunities for you to ask questions. And I think there's nothing wrong with asking a question that demonstrates that you've really thought about how you will fit into this. And I think there's a little bit of a delicate thing during the interview, especially because of where the balance of power is, and there will usually be another opportunity past the interview once you've received an offer if you have more politically sensitive questions to ask, and they're both important. But even in the interview, you should be asking the questions that really will complete the puzzle for you. So what is it about the place you're interviewing, the department you're interviewing, that is you don't know yet, but that if you want to hear in order to be really excited about it and imagine it as a long-term place of employment or a place that gets you where you want to go. Not every job you have is going to be a place you're at forever, but at least it points you in the direction you want to go.
Thanks. Any other comments that you might have to add to that?
I'd say, first of all, be sure to apply only to places that you want to work at. Mm-hmm. That is, if you are a very devout Baptist and want to teach only at a Baptist denominational college, only apply to those places because those places will likely make you happy. If you don't want to be in a rural area, if you don't want to be in Athens, Georgia, or Ames, Iowa, don't apply to those kinds of places because ultimately you won't fit into the culture and you won't be happy there. I'd say the place has to sell itself to you as well. And so the kinds that usually towards the second half or the last quarter of the interview, they'll ask you, do you have any questions of us? And I would say, come prepared with questions about the curriculum, about the teaching load, about the way in which multidisciplinary programs exist on the campus so that you can dive into it. Ask about research opportunities, ask about research funds, ask about the way the faculty interact with each other and what is missing in the way the faculty interact. Don't ask about salary, don't ask about spousal hires, don't ask about anything that tips your hand about your personal life that they may then proceed to question extensively. By law, they're not allowed to ask you questions about your sexual orientation, your marital status, your race, or anything of that sort. And if they start going down that route, you can stop and say, you know, I don't feel comfortable answering those kinds of questions. Can we talk about this and that or the other? Because then it keeps it, you know, because look, if you're at a small college, let's say Grinnell, they're going to have difficulty hiring young single men or young single women, because why will young single men and young single women not want to go there? There is no really urban center there. There are no other opportunities for dating and romance other than your students, which are usually strictly forbidden. And so you have to ask yourself, why would you apply to such a place if you think that you're going to be isolated and unhappy? And so those places are unlikely to want to hire a person that they think is going to be unhappy very quickly. And so understand where you are and ask questions about what kind of an institution it is. And again, don't ask about dating, don't ask about mating, don't ask about salary. If they give you an offer, that's when you start negotiating salary, spousal hires, you know, child care, housing subsidies, things of that sort.
Great, thank you, Ramon. So I think that gives us a very nice roundup of sort of the preparation phase. I think the main themes I heard were around knowing the role, knowing the interviewer. By the way, there's a handy little sheet that all of you should have that has little next steps. So as you hear these pearls of wisdom, I'd strongly encourage you to take notes so you can go back and ponder and try to see which of those are applicable to you as you go down the interviewing path. So I think we've got a pretty good coverage in terms, maybe even some of the presentation aspects. So we can go into the actual interview itself now and talk about, I think what we've covered pretty much are that a lot of how successful you're going to be during the interview is dependent on how well you prepared. I think we've gone over that pretty thoroughly. I think, Ramon, you started to touch upon sort of, you know, presentation, body language, things of that nature. So maybe I can just throw out the question around how do you ensure that, we talked about how you dress for the part and so forth, but how do you ensure that you're reading the cues well from the interviewer? Are there specific tips, cues, or things that you've seen work well, either, you know, sitting on the other side of the table or being an interviewee yourself, that you think would be helpful to our audience today? I'll throw it open to whoever feels comfortable taking that on. Josh?
Yeah, I think one way to do that is, in particular, when you're at a part of the interview where it's natural for it to be more interactive, is allow some pauses, right? So I think you're going to be nervous. It's a stressful situation, and depending on your personality type, one thing that can happen is you start talking and talking and talking, and one of the ways that you get the right cues within an interview is you allow the other person time to jump in. And again, I would assert to you that most of the time a good interviewer is trying to help you get to where they want you to be. So if you're open to those cues by allowing them to step in at the right time, that will help you get on track.
Thank you. David, you've been pretty silent, so do you have any thoughts that might be helpful?
I think one thing is to, you know, there's usually some kind of a social component to the interview, and that can be, you know, people are often a little bit more free there, and that can be a good point where you can just, you know, listen to people talking amongst themselves sometimes a little bit, and also it's a little bit more of a time where you can kind of probe them a little bit. They're not necessarily, you're not standing in front of a room of people, and so I think, you know, the kind of the social part of the interview is it's a good chance to get to know your colleagues, but it's definitely still part of the interview. I mean, they're still kind of trying to understand you, and it's also a good opportunity to understand them.
Great, thanks. So David, you picked up on...
Can I just add a couple of things?
Sorry.
The only other couple of things that I would emphasize is that before you go to an interview, notice when Katie Couric or when any of the television commentators, interview people, that they always have a smile. It may look artificial to you, but everyone on television always has a smile. From psychological studies with infants, we know that smiles really affect the people that are listening, that are listening and reacting to you. So practice in front of a mirror, smiling more. Try to have a facial expression that's not gloomy and drab, but rather that looks chipper and happy. Because they all want happy colleagues. They don't want depressed, manic, bipolar colleagues. Be sure to answer the questions that they ask you quickly. That is, don't go into a 10-minute disquisition if the interview is only going to be an hour, but rather keep your answers short so that more questions can be asked and so they can find out more about you in the 45 minutes that they are going to interview you. Now, we all tend to look in one direction. If we're right-handed, we tend to look at people on the right. If we're left-handed, we tend to look at people on the left. There's going to be a chair of the committee that is probably asking you questions. Be sure to make eye contact with everybody in the room so that they feel constant eye contact, so that they feel that you're not so nervous and you're only interested in the chair and power, and that everybody in the room really matters. So those are just the other kinds of things I would add for the dynamics of how you behave in the interview room.
Thank you.
On that subject, I would say be yourself. Just be the slightly amplified version of yourself, right? So you want to generate enthusiasm. I guess the advice I would give is it's sort of the, quote, cocktail party version of you. You have to be a little bit entertaining. A lot of times people will be, in many interview settings, will be going through many interviews in one day. It can be tiring. So if you are sapping the energy from the room, that is going to be a bad thing. And so I would certainly encourage smiling and anything you can do to express your enthusiasm. Still be yourself because it will come off as more authentic. If you try to be the thing that you think the place wants exactly and it has nothing to do with you, there's probably a problem. So it's best to be yourself. It will be about fit, but just crank it to 11 instead of 10.
Thank you. Ramon, is my smile good enough?
I think so.
Thank you. I just wanted to add one comment. I think you've had excellent observations. I noticed that I'm probably the only person other than you, Ramon, but I don't know if you're born here or you were born here, right?
Yes.
I was born and raised in a different country. I only came here when I was 24 years old, and I'm offering my perspective as something that might help those of you who are women and those of you who have an international background. It took me a while to get used. I'm from India, and you're supposed to be seen and not supposed to be heard. So it was a pretty challenging transition to, especially in consulting, to move to a position where you're able to talk confidently about what you can bring to the table and still not appear to be boastful. Now, I felt like I was the biggest braggart on the planet, and I kept getting feedback in school, in booth when we were preparing for interviews, that you're not talking enough about yourself, you're short selling yourself. And I would be like, my mom and dad would never deal with this. I mean, they'd just disown me. So all I'm asking, I think the only thing to keep in mind is if you come from a different culture, particularly an Asian culture, or if you're a woman and you feel that it's something that's very unnatural, you have to work yourself into it, maybe one step out of your comfort zone at a time, but it's absolutely vital for you. I think your point is very spot on. You have to be who you are, but you have to push the boundaries of who you are constantly so that over time and as your career develops, you become a much more authentic, fully expressed version of yourself without being hamstrung by all of these challenges. Just wanted to offer that up for what it was worth to all of you guys. We're kind of a little past the halfway point here, and we're kind of halfway through the topics. Are there any burning questions on preparation, presentation that we should take before we move to the follow-up and some of the other special considerations? Is there anyone that has a question? Yes?
I have a question. I don't believe we have microphones. If I'm wrong, but I was wondering if there's how to establish a conversational tone in an interview. You said interviewers are often interviewing multiple people, maybe in the same day or the same afternoon. So what happens if you get into a situation where the interviewers are just firing questions at you, they don't respond very well, and they really just want to get down to business and get through the interview? Is there a way to turn that around, or is there a way to improve that situation in the moment?
So for those of you who didn't hear, let me just paraphrase the question. I think it's a great question. To the extent that you're having trouble establishing rapport or facing other challenges, how do you overcome that, and is there still something you can do to establish that personal connection. I can give my shot and then I'll open it up to folks. No matter what you are, what I've found works is that everybody is a human being across the table. And that first instance, if you can find something that makes a connection, the school you went to, the country you're from, a sport you like, you make one comment, it takes less than 5 seconds, it immediately breaks the ice. Or if that still doesn't work, I would say, you can make a statement that's very non-threatening and say, it looks like you're having a very busy day, I hope it's going well for you. Or something very, very neutral that establishes that commonality of the human experience. I've found that works, but I'm happy to throw it open.
Yeah, I would agree. I think that there's usually these small moments before the formal interview where you're interacting with the people you're interviewing, and don't forget about those either. Those are practical opportunities to create a little bit of rapport. And the small talk part of it can be important to break out of what could otherwise be sort of a tedious task. And so, it's not a gallows walk to the room where you're being interviewed. You should take that opportunity to have a conversation. Maybe you have some background on the person you're talking to, and this is an informal way to establish a more human connection. So think about what you'll say in the 20 seconds before the interview if you have a chance to talk to someone. And again, not in such a scripted way, but just think through the types of interactions that might make it a little bit more human.
Ramon, David?
Yeah, I'd say that, at least in the social sciences and humanities, when you have an interview at a professional meeting, they're going to be interviewing 10 to 15 people, and each is going to get an hour slot. And they're going to rattle through those questions fairly rapidly, and there's not much you can do about it because they're going to have their checklist. And understand that frequently, if you don't get a job, it's not because of your qualifications, or it's not because you didn't have the right dress or the right tie. It's that, search committees are complicated groups of people, and each person on a search committee is going to have their own agenda of the kind of research that they like and the kind of people that they think are cutting edge. And those cutting edges, exist all over the department and certainly in a search committee. So what they're going to be looking for is, can this person, let's say they're advertising for a 20th century historian, can this person teach this and that and the other? Can they teach this and that and the other? How dynamic are the courses that they're proposing? And at the end of the day, they're going to compare the answers that all the candidates gave and say, well, candidate 1, 7, and 10 were the best ones on our curricular needs, and so those will be the ones that get invited to campus. I mean, don't feel put off if it is very cold, very sterile, and very routinized, because that's how they tend to be.
Yeah. I'd just like to comment on one thing which I think can be a pitfall, which is that typically, often at least when you're interviewing, it's because you're for a new job, whether it's within academia or in industry, it's because you're sort of ready to move up, and often the way you move up is to go someplace else and get a new job, and often that means that there's a new role that you'll be fulfilling in your new job that you may have had some experience with in your old job, but maybe not as much. So to use the academic example, most of you guys are grad students probably, and when you go from being a grad student, you're supposed to sort of be a good worker who can learn, right? That's your goal really, is to learn and learn all the techniques and learn science or whatever it is you're studying, and then apply that. And then when you interview for a postdoc, you're supposed to be able to do that, and there is that component, but now you're also supposed to be able to lead a little bit. You're supposed to be able to direct maybe some graduate students under you, and you're supposed to be able to interact with your postdoc advisor as more of a colleague, right? And so, and then when it's an even bigger step when you go from being a postdoc to a professor, because now you're not a student, you're not a highly trained worker, but you're supposed to be now someone who generates the direction of a field. And so it's important that when you interview, you kind of interview in your new role in some sense. And part of that goes back to this sort of amplified version of yourself. But you have to recognize that your new self is actually going to be a little bit different, and that's I think something which people really look for, especially at the faculty hiring level. Is that is this person just an incredibly smart, skilled person who did great research, or is this someone who's going to lead the next generation? And so,
yeah.
I think that's a great point, and it's something you can start doing now. And actually, I think that's a broader point than an interview. That's just like a good career approach, which is start to behave and start to model yourself on the next step up. Model yourself on where you want to go, not necessarily where you are now. If you're a junior grad student, look at the senior grad students and how they're performing and get up to that level. If you want to be a professor, go ahead and start asserting yourself like a professor with your professor. I mean, that might run into certain problems if you assume you have tenure, but but it can be useful when you do get to the interview to have had those experiences which demonstrate you're ready for the role. So I think that's a really great point and probably of broader utility than just for an interview.
Great, thanks. There's just one question that sort of came to mind that I'd like to throw to all of you, which is, I mean, I'm a U of C alum myself, and there's definitely a set of stereotypes that are associated with U of C grads. I know, it's from Northwestern. We have this little thing going on. But, you know, there's certainly the stereotype, you know, so I'd just be curious, first of all, do you have a perspective on that? And secondly, what are those stereotypes? If they're positive stereotypes, how do you make sure they work for you? And if they happen to be negative stereotypes for the type of role you're considering or the job you're considering, are there specific things you can do to counter the impact of those? Anyone want to?
Oh, sure, I'll take it. So I think, yeah, I mean, certainly maybe from the University of Chicago, but also I think in general there's a lot of stereotypes about science. So I can give you a personal example for an interview that was more important than my faculty interview, which was the first date with my wife. And I think you know, there's this opinion that you know, in science it's sort of almost an idealized notion, a romanticized notion that you're a grad student toiling away in the basement. My lab is in the basement, but you know, that you're toiling away. You don't talk to anybody. You're kind of nerdy and introspective, and you only think about numbers or whatever, whatever your research is. And I think it's important to emphasize that, you know, science actually isn't really like that. I mean, you guys probably know. I mean, you actually are typically working very closely with a group of people in a lab. You interact a lot with other people in the department, your advisor. You go to international conferences. You travel all over the world. You really have a very worldly experience. We get to really meet people from all different cultures, and I think that's, you know, and to emphasize that aspect of it, and you know, kind of, I think those other aspects that, you know, I mean, sometimes people will just will say that they like to almost subdue that, but actually, I think it's a really important part of what you have to do to both to be successful in science, and for me at least, that's one of the fun parts about being a scientist. I mean, I actually love, like, you know, being in the basement and working on my computer. But if I had to do that all day, I wouldn't be too happy. So I think emphasizing that, I think especially to, you know, if you're going from kind of a science background to outside of science, but even within science, I think it's really helpful to let people know that you appreciate that aspect of it and that you have experience in that way.
Thank you, David. That's a pretty cool point. And Ramon,
I'd say that there are a number of stereotypes of University of Chicago graduate students and PhDs that predominate in the humanities and social sciences. And I'd say most of them are very positive stereotypes about the lexical, philological approach that we tend to have here in terms of instruction. And I think it's not going to be a handicap if you apply to any of the Ivy League schools, any of the elite Research One institutions across the country, University of Pennsylvania, University of California, you know, the major state universities are going to see you as highly educated, you know, philosophically dexterous, and probably quite inquisitive. Where you're going to probably see more problems is if you apply to small liberal arts colleges, where this kind of very intense, rigorous education at a very high level is not necessarily what they're doing with undergraduate teaching. Or if you're going to go to a community college or a state teaching college, let's say San Diego State University, Tennessee State, Alabama State, these are schools that are going to want to put an emphasis not on your kind of rigorous theoretical and research and formation. Rather, they're going to want a very different kind of instruction. And you're going to be faced with students that are not University of Chicago students. I mean, we select a very small slice very inquisitive, very often called nerdy students, and those are the ones that you're used to teaching and interacting with. And at state schools, you're going to find a very different type of student that maybe is barely learning English, maybe the first generation to go to college, maybe doesn't have aspirations to go on to get a PhD, and would be quite, content working for a local police force as a social worker or as a bank teller at the local corner bank. So I'd say that's where you're going to have to do more at those small undergraduate teaching colleges, is where you're going to have to do more preparation to try to divest yourself of that nerdy, brainy, overzealous, contentious kind of individual that we train here at the University of Chicago.
Thank you. And I think, the main messages that I heard, and they resonated with me as well, is first of all is to highlight your whole personality, not just the part, David, to your point, of your research or your specific academic interests. Ramon, you brought up some really good points about making sure that you don't overemphasize certain aspects and incorporate other points of view as well. And definitely resonated with me because, coming from Booth, going to consulting, definitely the image was that, you're a quant jock, you don't really have any social skills, can't look beyond the tip of your nose, and so on and so forth. So definitely, I can definitely relate to that because I had to do a lot of going out of my way to be social and so forth to be accepted as a normal human being and not just a Booth grad. I don't know, did you have any additional comments on that?
No, I think I won't make any comments on UChicago.
Good for you.
But
you're in enemy territory.
But yeah, exactly right. Yeah, what I'll say is, I think it's good to know. For me, I think it comes probably more from your academic background, and for some reason, I feel the way it tends to fall down is on that quantitative/communication spectrum, and I think it's a bit of a false dichotomy, says the person with a physics and English degree, but I think it really does, right? But if you imagine that someone is going to view you as a quant jock, or is going to imagine that you're not capable of doing an integral and that will somehow be very important to your job, I think that you're going to want to make sure you address that. And so to the extent of, in your interview preparation, understanding what the qualifications for the job are, what's going to set you not just meeting the bar but exceeding the bar, because a lot of times what happens is, like, what's the honest way I would view a UChicago grad? I would say, wow, that person went through a filter, they're a smart person, I don't really know that much about them yet, but they've jumped over a bar, and now I'm looking for some exceptionalism across some dimensions that we're looking for. And so just understanding what parts of your background would not raise any questions about where you're exceptional and which parts you need to make the case for are pretty important. And having spent, I did a PhD and postdoc basically in the basement of a windowless lab, I knew which part I needed to make sure I emphasized when I was coming into the light again. So.
Thank you. It's a great point. It's about,
Can I just add one thing to that?
Go ahead.
I just remembered an interview that when I taught at the University of California, San Diego, we had a University of Chicago anthropologist come to interview for a job. And again, because all the classes at the University of Chicago, at least in the social science and humanities division, are very small. I mean, 20 people mostly in a seminar, usually rarely anything more than 15 to 20 students. And so when he came to the interview at the University of California, we used to routinely offer 500 student introductory courses. And he said in his interview, I wasn't at the actual meeting where he said it, but he says, well, I'm not prepared to teach 500 students in a class. And that immediately, lost him the job. He was highly qualified, everybody liked him, but they said, oh, if he's not going to feel comfortable teaching 500 and he thinks he's an elite and only has to teach 20 students, in every class, then we don't want him. We don't need him here. He has to be able to carry his load. And so, understanding what you have to do at a place is
That's a great point.
important.
Thank you. So why don't we now move into sort of the follow-up and the wrap-up. One of the things we tend to forget typically is that we think it's over when the interview is over, and it's really not. At least from a business perspective, I do know that follow-up is important, particularly as an additional sales tool to make sure that there are any unaddressed concerns or still open issues that you think might not seal the deal. It's important to follow up on that. I'm just curious across the board here, what comments you'd have from your particular perspectives on the importance of follow-up and what you would need to do as an interviewee to follow up.
Yes, I had an interesting experience with my interview. So I always just, as a routine, so when you go on an academic interview, you'll meet with the whole department, so that's like 20 or 30 people. And I always would just write just a very short thank you email, which would typically be about 2 lines that said, I had a great visit, I really enjoyed our conversation about X, I just thought it was sort of the polite thing to do. It wasn't necessarily particularly a tool. And I had two interesting experiences from this. So one was that when I got here, it was after I'd already arrived. One of the professors had mentioned, he's like, it really struck me that you actually wrote me a thank you note. You're the only candidate to do that. So apparently it did maybe have a very small impact on it. I don't think it probably didn't sway the thing, but so people do care and notice. That's the first thing. And the other thing is, especially in academia, but also I think in industry, right? When you if you talk about networking, right? This networking is very important in any field. And when you're at that stage of interviewing for a job, whether it's a postdoc or a faculty position or any job, right? You're going to be going around possibly the whole country, like in academia. You'll go to all the elite institutions, and you're going to meet with every professor in every elite institution that you get a chance to interview with it. And so, that you're going to meet 100 people, all at the top of their fields, and all of the people that you would want to know. And you'll have a chance to talk with them for an hour, and under very favorable circumstances, you'll get to go out to dinner with them and have a dinner. They'll remember you when you were a grad student and they came to visit your lab. They may not remember you, but they'll definitely remember you as a candidate. And so that's not just useful in terms of getting the job that you end up getting, but after that, that network of people who you had favorable interactions with, that's a very valuable resource. It's helped me in order to, later to hire postdocs and to recruit graduate students. It's obviously, it's important to, start, for starting new collaborations. And also, of course, those people will be your peer referees in any publications you submit. And I imagine you guys can comment on it, but I would imagine that in industry it's also, very useful. So, yeah.
Did you have anything to add to that, George?
Yeah, I guess once you get into the after, it's worth talking about the before too, and really the idea of an interview being, it's a fairly long process in almost any job that I think most of you would be interested in. And so to the sense that, you will often have multiple interviews, and you will often be talking to people from the departments or companies that you're interested in beforehand. Whenever you have the opportunity to make a human connection, which includes the actual formal interview, it's great to follow up. And I would argue the thank you note is really great, and to whatever extent you can have an anchor within that note, which is brief, which reminds that person who you were and that positive discussion you had, that can be quite useful, again, to go to an earlier question about how when you walk into that room it feels human and not robotic, because I think there's always the need for a way to make the process objective, and then the reality is that objectivity is married to the social networking that you do in your academic conferences as you go to events like this and more specialized focused events within the field or industry of your choice, and making those connections and following up with those people is really important part of your social capital.
Thank you. Ramon, did you have?
Yeah, very quickly I'd say I like Josh, and I've seen the Josh and David solution where the interviewee sends a 3 or 4 sentence note saying, I enjoyed the interview, I enjoyed meeting you, if you need anything else, do write or call. And then stop there. End the communication for the time being. And I'd say also the reverse, right when you're applying. Most job applicant pools have, at least at the University of Chicago, 400 applicants. And so nobody wants to be pestered by you every other week. I mean, when I was at San Diego, I remember one student who had applied for a job. Oh, my book review in the journal of this and that just got accepted. Now, book reviews don't count in the world, but why he kept telling me that this book review, or oh, I just got a positive mention in this and that. And if all 405 applicants for a job kept doing this to a search chair, the search chair would go crazy. So apply, give your phone number and your address, and they will find you if they need you. After the interview, fine, send a short note, but then stop there until they send you the note saying you've either been selected or they've gone on to somebody else, and thank you for submitting your materials. After the whole process is completely done, after they announce who has gotten it, after a few months have passed, feel free to write or call the chair of the committee and say, oh, I was very disappointed that I didn't get this job. Are there any pointers that you might give me? This was my first job interview or my second. Are there any pointers you can give me to better prepare myself for future job interviews or future job applications? And they'll often be very frank with you, very honest, and they'll probably say, everybody liked you, but you just didn't fit in the curriculum. Everybody loved your work, but you wanted a spousal appointment, and we don't have a spousal appointment, and we knew you wouldn't come. Blah, 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 blah. They'll tell you.
Right. Wonderful pointer. So we're kind of running out of time, so maybe we'll close with one piece of advice that you've received in, throughout your career that you think would be helpful to share with our audience here about the whole interview process. If you want them to take away one thing, what would that be? We'll start with you.
I'd say the interview process is the end of the process. I'd say start earlier on. I mean, the first thing that my graduate advisor said to me when I finished the dissertation was to make 40 copies of my dissertation and send them to everyone that I wanted to know my work. Because it was going to take 5 years before the dissertation was revised into a book, and it was going to be 2 or 3 more years before that book appeared. It was going to be a long time before people knew who you were. So I followed that advice, and from that, somebody read the dissertation, and I got a MacArthur Prize Fellowship.
Congratulations. Thank you, Ramon. David?
Yeah, I would certainly agree with that what you do before is definitely more deterministic than what you do there. But I guess the other thing I would just say is that you should try and have fun with it. I mean, it sounds kind of grueling to get interviewed by all these people, but I personally found it really exciting and fun. You go on a tour of the country, all expenses paid with nice restaurants and stuff, and then everybody tells you about their work, and you get to hear about everything, and they want you to ask interesting questions, and so you can really ask them about it, and they're really interested in you, and they want to hear what you're doing. And it's not that often in academia that people actually really care what you're doing, so so that's really nice. And so I would also just encourage you guys to just really enjoy the process and get as much out of it as you can.
Thank you, David. Josh?
That's good advice. I like that actually, because I think that that goes a long way to. I would go back to the old Sesame Street, be yourself, but in doing that, you will find a job that is a good fit for you, right? So if you're unable to create a version of yourself, and it might be the version of yourself that you aspire to be that works in that job, then it's probably not the right one for you. And I think that, again, if we're going to go back to one of the themes here, which is a two-way street, use that as an opportunity to reinvent yourself in the form that you want to have the next few years of your life or the next 30 years of your life. And the place that it works for you, if you're projecting that true sense of yourself, it's actually more likely to work, because you're going to be looking in a rare pool. And by not trying to hammer yourself into this like false mold, it's going to be much more likely to work out.
Thank you very much. And I'll share with you what somebody told me a long time ago that I found incredibly helpful, both to drive the interview as well as to drive down the nervousness, is to pretend you're a consultant to the person you're interviewing. So you're always interested in their problem and how you're trying to solve it with what you've got at the table. I've always used that, and I found that pretty helpful throughout multiple interviews throughout my career. So I just wanted to offer that up as well. So are there any questions before we close that, yes?
So a lot of the information that you gave was actually very, very good for academic interviews, and I'm actually very excited about that. In addition, though, you mentioned, though, in order to prepare for an interview, you need to know who your interviewers are. What is that going to be like for the business or industry when you're not exactly sure who is going to be sitting in the room when you're conducting the interview? So the actual question I have is, what do you look for? Do you just look at the website? Do you look at their mission statement?
Ask them.
Ask them. Okay.
And
Before they even interview you?
No, when you get an invitation for an interview, just simply say, who is going to be interviewing me?
Oh.
It's that simple. And if they don't answer it, just call the secretary. The secretary will tell you.
As a great suggestion, I would add to that and say, yes, definitely look at the websites, look at some of the annual reports, understand what the organization is doing, and have 2 or 3 high-level questions strategically where they're headed to understand you can ask an open-ended questions. What are the 3 things that are most concerning to you in this industry or in your role? What is the top 3 strategic priorities and why? I don't know, Josh.
No, I think that's right. So there's a lot of information about the company. So by being engaged with what the company is up to, you automatically are plugging into something that your interviewer is interested in. There are typically a lot of events beforehand for many of these companies, so get to know them, understand the culture of the company, and people are not monolithic within that, but if you at least understand, and if by meeting 5, 6 people from a particular organization, you'll start to get a feel for what is the common theme there. And then typically, yeah, there are ways to directly figure out who your person is sometimes. Sometimes it's that it just won't be available to you until maybe the day of, and you'll get a little card that has a brief bio of the person 15 minutes beforehand. It can really run the spectrum. But there are addressable pieces of that that will allow you to have some connection with the people in industry you're talking to.
Thanks. Thank you. Any other questions? Yes.
So all of the advice has been great, and this question is just about an absolute worst case scenario where you feel like the interview did not go right. And have you ever had an interviewee come back from that interview? In your follow-up, can you do something, say something, and maintain some level of pride while coming back from mistakes you made in your interview?
Do you want to?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think it depends. If you really bombed it, okay, maybe you bombed it so badly you're not going to work at that particular department or at that firm. If you just feel like you did and then you're invited back, that probably means you didn't bomb it, and you're just holding yourself to a very high standard, which is great, but that means that you should reflect on what you think didn't go well, and if you're invited back, it probably is a good sign that if you can improve your performance, you're going to be doing well.
That's a great answer.
I'll give you one instance. When we did a job interview, and we had put a pitcher of water on the table, and the job candidate proceeded to drink the whole pitcher of water, and then had to go to the bathroom several times through the interview. That did not go well. But again, 3 months after the job interview is done, let's say that you're not called back, you didn't get the job, 3 months afterwards you can call and say, is there a possibility to chat for 5 minutes about what I did wrong, how it could improve my performance? Most people will usually respond and give you reasons.
Great. Thanks. I think we're out of time. What I would offer is I'm certainly going to stick around, and for those of our fellow panelists who can stick around, we'll be here and happy to answer questions.